Alright, welcome to the just-in-time video talking about some points to ponder associated with Chapter 3. I am going to be talking about 4 points that I think are worth pondering. Obviously there are many things that we could discuss within this chapter, but I want to keep it short and to the point and focused on those things that I think there's some room for some more thinking and some debate. So, first point number 1, deals with Section 3.2b, which is titled Historical Beginnings of Unsustainability. This starts on page 56. Here your authors are arguing that in fact there's a pretty straightforward history of unsustainability that we can go ahead and track, more modern history, starting in the 15th century with the age of discovery and colonialism. And they talk about basically outsourcing problems and going to the colonies, as it were, to get the resources that we seem to be lacking in our own country. So we want citrus fruits, we'll go to the colonies and bring that back to England. We don't want our criminals in our own country, we'll ship them off to Australia. And the authors argue, I think fairly convincingly, that that mindset continues today, where we'll find solutions elsewhere. We'll get cheaper labor in another country and we'll ship our garbage offshore. So we continue with this pretty unsustainable behavior. The second is the first industrial revolution, which starts in the mid-1700s, and here you see movement from the rural areas to the urban areas with the rise of factories. You see increased wages, you see generally better living conditions for a greater percentage of the population. This is followed by the second industrial revolution in the mid-1800s. Here's where we start to see greater dependence on fossil fuels. Finally, we have this green revolution, what your authors call this green revolution, starting in the 1940s, where we're using chemicals to alter the way that we're able to produce food. So thanks to fertilizers and thanks to pesticides, we're able to grow tremendously more volume on smaller plots of land. This means that basically we need less labor in those agricultural areas, which again encourages more movement to the urban areas, more involvement in jobs and tasks that are no longer tied to the land. Now, when you take those 4 pieces of history together, it certainly does look like a pretty convincing case for, wow, people should have been able to see this coming, that all of these things were going to add up to a pretty unsustainable future, the point where we find ourselves right now. But of course, that's a great example of hindsight bias, where you stand in a given spot and you look backward and you say, man, we should have been able to see, we should have been able to predict. But the truth is, human beings are not especially good at predicting, especially when we talk about trying to predict phenomena that are the result of interrelated and complex pieces. So to try and imagine that something that would improve the lot of many people, work that increased their wages that they had, to say that's going to lead to a population explosion, which will in turn lead to a degradation of the environment, that would have been a pretty big leap for, well, anybody to take, certainly in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s. I don't think people had no sense in reality of how large the planet was, what its resources were, and so on. So that's one point I would say, hindsight bias. Let's be careful not to engage in that. The second is these things that have, at least in some respects, contributed to where we find ourselves today. Let's not forget that they changed many people's lives, the quality of many people's lives for the better in ways that we now take for granted, where people who historically might not have known where their next meal was coming from, or whether they would be living in a warm shelter, or whether they would be able to provide for their family, whether they would have access to medicine, how long would they live past the age of 40. In developed countries in 2015, we're in pretty good shape with respect to those issues. The second big point that I would make about this chapter deals with Section 3.2e, called The Status Quo in the Future. And here our authors, give us 4 scenarios, and I'd like to very briefly talk about each of them and ask you to ponder them. The first one is the Pollyanna scenario where both society and the environment win. How fantastic, right? Okay, so we have sustainable development. We all live within the resource limits of a healthy planet. Well, that's a fantastic possibility for our future, a fantastic scenario. I think it would require human beings to be substantially and significantly changed in terms of their behaviors and interests, their values. An awful lot would have to change in order to achieve that particular scenario. I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility, but I would say there is very little about human behavior historically that would suggest that that scenario has a likely chance of occurrence. The second is that society wins and the environment loses. So we have some developing countries that manage to achieve a particular level of economic welfare that is good for them, but not at all good for the global ecosystem. I think we've already lived through this scenario. The third scenario, society loses and the environment wins. I don't know that this one is labeled particularly correctly because, in fact, I would say some part of society is winning big time in this scenario. In fact, it's the people who are wealthy who can afford to make substitutes where other people cannot. Your authors refer to these folks as the industrial elite. I'm not sure that's the best characterization of this group of people, but the reality is there are some people who can basically buy themselves away from an unsustainable existence, at least in the sense that they are able to continue providing for themselves and the people that they appear to care for. But basically it says the industrial elite will have reached a stable situation, while poorer countries will have remained economically underdeveloped. I think this extends, it's not only one country versus another. It's not that the United States is especially well off while others are poor. It's even within countries. So within the United States there are people who are very well off and others who are not well off at all. And we see the impact not only on our social system, but we also see the impact on our economic system, and we see the impact on our environment. So by having these small groups of people, perhaps through not the fruit of their own labor, they have positioned themselves well economically. They are often doing that at the expense of others. The fourth is the dystopic scenario in which both society and the environment lose. And I think for reasons that should be pretty straightforward, this is the scenario that we're all trying to avoid. So I think it's fair to say that we're trying to work toward the very first scenario, but the real issue is, practically speaking, how do we get there, knowing that human beings tend to act in their self-interest, not altruistically, and that first scenario requires a much greater emphasis placed on altruism as a value. So there's something for you to puzzle over, and maybe you come up with a solution even this evening, who knows. The third point that I want to raise deals with section 3.3c, interpreting sustainability, and your authors talk about a number of views worth noting. This starts on page 63, and they have 4 couplets or 4 pairs that they contrast, and basically the first word in each couplet is associated with a weak perspective on sustainability, and the second word in each couplet is associated with a strong focus on sustainability. So we have, the first words are fragmentation, substitution, status quo, and masters, and that all represents the negative end of the spectrum, and the more positive end of the spectrum is holistic, complementation, change, and equals. And I think within those pairs, within those couplets, there's actually quite a bit of variety in terms of what is practical, what is realistic, given what we know about human nature, given what we know about our history as human beings. For example, trying to approach the issue of sustainability from a holistic perspective, while it makes sense theoretically, is in fact incredibly difficult and maybe even not feasible, generally speaking, when you start talking practical. How do you do it? You have to start with something. So it's almost inevitable that you will start with one of the capitals and try to figure out, well, which one do we think we can leverage best? And then maybe that enables us to work on the rest. But trying to take the 30,000 feet view and, oh, okay, we'll think about all 3 of the capitals, At the same time, again, theoretically it makes great sense. Practically speaking, I'm not sure that people have the mental capacity, or, and including myself, the mental capacity, the resources, the physical and other resources to actually perform that. Some practical considerations that are central to achieving sustainability that the authors point out that I think are worth discussing. Process or outcome? Well, truthfully, it's got to be both. Intergenerational or intra-generational? Again, it's got to be both. Short or long-term thinking? You know, this has almost reached the state of cliche. We all know what the right answer is. The right answer is long-term. Yeah, okay, well, what does that even mean? Is it 2 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 7 generations? Is it longer than that? How far out can anybody really realistically imagine how the world might operate and what the key levers might be? There's a reason why we tend to think short-term. It's because we can manage that. We can actually do it, and the rewards associated with doing it are sufficiently close to the time of our thinking and salient enough that we do it again and again and again. So on this one, I wouldn't even bother including the couplet, quite frankly. Well-having or well-being is basically stuff versus experiences. I think we can guess what the right choice is there. Development or growth, which is basically quality versus quantity. Lots of good arguments for why we should be focused on quality instead of quantity. And then growth versus degrowth. And here we're really talking about, does the world really need to spin around the idea of continually growing, or can we also talk about maybe focusing on stability or even retrenchment? The whole tiny houses movement is a great example of a retrenchment philosophy. We will have more by having less. All right, fourth point, very simply, how do we actually manage business sustainability? Well, here's what I want you to think about with this. Only 1% of all of the companies in the United States are publicly traded. Most companies in the United States are small. They have fewer than 10 employees. Trying to account for and manage the impacts of sustainable practices requires our educational institutions and others involved in setting standards, for example, the accounting standards, to get focused on creating tools that the average person can use. Not complicated tools, not tools that require more than relatively straightforward software. We need the QuickBooks of sustainable assessment and management. And I would argue that when we reach the point where we have made the tools sufficiently straightforward and simple so that anybody with an 8th grade education, and better of course, but 8th grade at the high, right there, expectation can't be that they have a college degree. It has to be an 8th grade level of literacy. When those tools have been created and those tools are available for a price that the average small business owner can afford, that's when we're going to see some serious change in terms of both assessment and managing for sustainability. And I'll leave you on that thought for this chapter.